What if I told you Iran was a fashion capital, a cultural melting pot, a beacon of progress? Sounds like fiction. It was history, and its disappearance holds crucial lessons. Picture Tehran in the 1960s. The streets are not filled with the images we see today. Instead, you see women in miniskirts and bell-bottoms, cinemas playing Hollywood films, and university campuses buzzing with intellectual debate, often indistinguishable from those in Paris or Berkeley. This was the Iran of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. He envisioned a great civilization, a modern, secular, and powerful nation. But was this vision truly for all Iranians? Or was it a fragile veneer painted over a deeply divided society? In 1963, the Shah launched his White Revolution, a sweeping series of reforms from land redistribution to granting women the right to vote. On the surface, it was a sprint towards modernity. Literacy rates climbed, and a new, educated middle class emerged, enjoying unprecedented freedoms and economic opportunities. But beneath this glossy surface, a different story was unfolding. The rapid Westernization was seen by many not as progress, but as an assault on traditional values and national identity. And the Shah's methods for maintaining control were anything but progressive. How did a leader pushing for modernization also create one of the most feared secret police forces in the world? The SAVAK, the Shah's intelligence agency, became a symbol of his autocratic rule. Dissent was brutally crushed. Political opponents, students, and intellectuals disappeared into a network of prisons. The oil boom of the 1970s flooded the country with wealth, but it was a wealth that flowed disproportionately to a small elite, connected to the throne, widening the chasm between the rich and the poor, the secular and the devout. It was in this fertile ground of discontent that a powerful and unlikely opposition began to coalesce, centered around a figure who had been exiled for years. From a small home outside Paris, the voice of one man, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, began to resonate with millions back in Iran, offering a radically different vision for the nation's soul. By the late 1970s, the Shah's Iran was a paradox. It was a military powerhouse and a key ally of the United States, yet it was also oppressed. The parties in the royal court grew more lavish, while discontent in the streets and the mosques grew more organized. Protests, once scattered, became massive, coordinated demonstrations. The Shah, weakened by cancer and indecisive leadership, began to lose his grip on power day by day. In January of 1979, the man who called himself the King of Kings boarded a plane and left Iran for the last time. He thought it was a temporary vacation. The world was about to discover it was the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new and terrifyingly uncertain. Universities booming, art exploding, a generation shaping its own destiny. This was Tehran, before the silence. Forget the images you think you know. Picture this: the late 1960s and 1970s in the capital of Iran. Tehran was a city buzzing with a new kind of energy. Its streets were a tapestry of Western fashion and traditional clothing, its cafes filled with the smoke of intellectual debate. Women were not only attending universities in record numbers, they were becoming doctors, lawyers, and even cabinet ministers. This rapid transformation seemed to promise an unstoppable march toward modernity. But was everyone marching to the same beat? This era was the culmination of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's, grand vision. His White Revolution was a series of ambitious reforms launched in 1963, aimed at modernizing Iran from the top down. Land was redistributed, literacy programs were launched, and massive industrial projects were funded by a seemingly endless river of oil money. Beneath the glossy surface of progress, however, deep cracks were beginning to form. The oil boom created staggering wealth, but it also widened the gap between the rich elite and the struggling masses. And while the Shah's secret police, the dreaded SAVAK, but who exactly were these dissenters? The opposition was not a single entity. It was a complex alliance of strange bedfellows. Secular leftists, inspired by anti-colonial movements across the globe, stood alongside devout followers of a charismatic cleric exiled in Iraq, a man named Ruhollah Khomeini. They shared little in terms of ideology, but they were united by a common enemy. The Shah, increasingly isolated, celebrated 2,500 years of Persian monarchy with an extravagant party that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, while many of his people felt left behind. Could a nation so divided truly hold itself together? By 1977 and 1978, the tension was palpable. The intellectual debates in the cafes had spilled into the streets as protests. The whispers in the mosques had become defiant sermons broadcast on smuggled cassette tapes. A whole generation, raised on the promise of a modern future, was now demanding a different one. The city held its breath. The old world was dying, and a new one was struggling to be born. The silence was about to be broken by the roar of revolution, a vision of progress so ambitious, so sweeping, it contained the very seeds of its own dramatic undoing. This is the Shah's legacy. We often see the 1979 Iranian Revolution as a sudden explosion, but its fuse was lit years earlier, not with malice, but with the best of intentions. To understand the firestorm, you have to understand the dream that preceded it. Meet Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. By the early 1960s, he was a monarch determined to forge a new destiny for his nation. He envisioned an Iran that would leapfrog centuries of development, transforming from a traditional agrarian society into a modern industrial powerhouse, a great civilization on the world stage. How could one man hope to achieve such a monumental task? His plan was a bold, top-down series of reforms he called the White Revolution, launched in 1963. It was a revolution from the throne itself. On paper, the goals were undeniably noble. Land reform would break the grip of feudal landlords and distribute land to millions of tenant farmers. A literacy corps would send educated young Iranians into the countryside to teach reading and writing. Perhaps most radically, women were granted the right to vote and hold public office, a seismic shift in the social fabric. And to pay for it all, Iran was sitting on a sea of black gold. The oil boom of the 1970s flooded the state's coffers with unimaginable wealth, billions upon billions of dollars. The Shah's modernization plans went into overdrive. Gleaming skyscrapers pierced the Tehran skyline, state-of-the-art factories were built, and the military was armed with the most advanced weapons the United States could sell. But this river of wealth was also carving deep, unseen canyons through Iranian society. The rapid change was disorienting. Millions of villagers, displaced by agricultural reforms that didn't always work, flooded into cities that weren't ready for them, finding themselves lost in sprawling, impoverished shantytowns. A new class of westernized elites, enriched by oil contracts and corruption, flaunted a lifestyle that felt alien and offensive to the devout and the traditional. And who was speaking for these disaffected masses? The very people the Shah's reforms had marginalized, the Shia clergy. They saw the West-oxification of Iran, the promotion of women's rights, and the king's autocratic rule as a direct assault on the nation's Islamic identity. But any voice of dissent was ruthlessly silenced. The Shah's secret police, the infamous SAVAK, became a symbol of the regime's paranoia and brutality, its prisons filled with anyone deemed an enemy of the state. Progress was being delivered, but it was being enforced by an iron fist. By the late 1970s, Iran was a nation of profound contradictions. It was a land of ancient history hurtling toward a future it hadn't chosen, a society growing richer and more divided with each passing day. The Shah, increasingly isolated and ill, saw only the gleaming facade of his creation. Blind to the deep fists a storm was gathering, fueled by resentment, faith, and a deep-seated desire for a different kind of revolution. They called it a golden age. For most, it was an era of stark inequality and the chilling whisper of a secret police. The world saw a nation rapidly modernizing, a beacon of progress in the Middle East, but beneath the gleaming surface, a different story was unfolding, a story of power, control, and deep-seated unrest. But what was the true price of this ambitious national project? This transformation was driven by the Shah's White Revolution, a sweeping series of reforms launched in the 1960s. It promised land to the peasants, literacy for the masses, and even the right to vote for women. On paper, it was a bold leap into the 20th century. In reality, it was also a tool for consolidating absolute monarchical power. And the primary instrument of that power was a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. The Sazamane Etellaat va Amniat Keshvar, known to the world as SAVAK. This was more than an intelligence agency. It was a pervasive force of internal security, its agents infiltrating every corner of society, silencing dissent with arrests, torture, and executions. So while the state's iron grip tightened, another, more subtle force was eroding the very foundations of the regime. The oil boom of the 1970s flooded the country with unprecedented wealth. This funded massive infrastructure projects and created a new, westernized urban elite living in luxury. But this river of money barely trickled down. It created a chasm between the fabulously rich and the vast majority who were left behind, struggling with inflation and a sense of cultural dislocation. The rapid influx of Western culture felt like an assault on traditional values, creating a deep social and spiritual unease. Two powerful opposing currents were now flowing through Iranian society, one secular and modern, the other deeply religious and traditional. How long could they coexist before one inevitably overwhelmed the other? By the late 1970s, the cracks in the facade were impossible to ignore. Intellectuals, university students, and the long-suppressed middle class began to voice their opposition. But they found a powerful, unifying voice in an exiled cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. His message of social justice and Islamic identity resonated with millions who felt alienated by the Shah's regime. The streets, once symbols of modern order, became stages for massive, defiant protests. The once unshakable peacock throne began to tremble. The so-called Golden Age was burning to its end, and a revolutionary storm was gathering, one that would not just topple a king, but would change the course of history for the entire world. A generation questioned democracy. A nation rejected the West, and a forgotten voice from exile prepared to reshape history. To the outside world in the 1960s and 70s, Iran looked like a pillar of stability in the Middle East. A modernizing monarchy, fueled by oil and backed by the United States. But this was a carefully constructed facade. Beneath the surface of progress, fractures were deepening, spreading through every corner of Iranian society. And the source of this dissent was not what you might expect. It began, in many ways, decades earlier. In 1953, a coup backed by the American Central Intelligence Agency and British MI6 overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister. This single event planted a seed of profound mistrust against the West, a wound that would never truly heal. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was restored to power, and he embarked on a white revolution, a sweeping campaign of modernization. But these reforms, intended to strengthen his rule, paradoxically created new enemies. On university campuses, students, who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this new era, debated forbidden ideas. They read Marx, they spoke of democracy, and they felt the suffocating presence of the Shah's notorious secret police, the SAVAK. What kind of future were they truly being offered if they could not even speak freely? Meanwhile, in the bazaars and mosques, a different kind of opposition was stirring. Nationalists still mourned the loss of their sovereignty, and the religious establishment saw the Shah's secularism and Western culture as a direct attack on Iran's very soul. All these disparate groups, the students, the intellectuals, the merchants, the clerics, were simmering with discontent. But they lacked a unifying force, a single voice to channel their anger. That voice would come from the most unlikely of places, exile, from a quiet home, first in Turkey, then in Iraq. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. He had been forced out of Iran in 1964 for denouncing the Shah. But distance did not silence him. His sermons, recorded on simple cassette tapes, were smuggled into Iran by the thousands. These tapes became the lifeblood of a revolution. They were copied, passed from hand to hand, and listened to in secret gatherings, bypassing all state censorship. What powerful message did they contain that could unite such different people? Khomeini spoke a language that resonated with millions. He condemned the corruption of the monarchy, the influence of America, and the erosion of traditional values. He offered not a political platform, but a moral crusade. As the 1970s wore on, the Shah's regime, riddled with extravagance and brutality, became increasingly fragile, and a generation of Iranians from every walk of life began to look not to the throne, but to the voice on the cassette tapes for their salvation. The stage was set. The players were in position. A forgotten cleric was about to become the leader of a global movement, and a nation was holding its breath, waiting for the final revolutionary act. Was the Iranian Revolution inevitable? From the outside, especially in the West, the Iran of the late 1970s looked like a pillar of stability, a modernizing monarchy, flush with oil wealth, armed with one of the world's most powerful militaries. But what was really happening beneath this glittering, carefully constructed surface? To understand the explosion that was coming, we have to look back to the 1960s and the Shah's so-called White Revolution. This was an ambitious top-down program of reforms: land distribution, voting rights for women, literacy campaigns, designed to rapidly transform Iran into a powerful, secular, industrial nation. It was a vision of a great civilization, as the Shah himself called it. But who exactly was being left behind by this forced march towards the future? While a new westernized elite flourished in Tehran, enjoying the fruits of an oil boom, massive social dislocations were tearing at the country's fabric. Millions poured from the countryside into overcrowded cities, creating sprawling slums. Inflation spiraled out of control, and the gap between the fabulously wealthy and the struggling poor became a chasm. And it wasn't just about economics. A deeper, more profound conflict was brewing. The Shah's aggressive push for Westernization felt like an assault on Iran's traditional and religious identity for many. This cultural anxiety was compounded by suffocating political repression. There was no freedom of speech, no political opposition was tolerated, and any dissent was ruthlessly crushed by the Shah's notorious secret police, the SAVAK, which had been established with assistance from the United States Central Intelligence Agency. So, with every path for peaceful opposition systematically destroyed, where could all that anger and frustration possibly go? Into this vacuum stepped a voice from exile, a voice that belonged to an elderly cleric who had been banished 15 years earlier, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From France, his sermons, recorded on simple cassette tapes, were smuggled into Iran and spread like wildfire. He spoke a language that resonated deeply, not of Western materialism, but of social justice, national independence, and a return to Islamic values. By late 1977, the disparate threads of opposition, the students, the intellectuals, the bazaar merchants, and the devout, were beginning to weave together, drawn to Khomeini's uncompromising stand. The country was a tinderbox, a disconnected monarch, a resentful population, and an exiled leader whose voice was suddenly everywhere. All that was needed was a spark,